If you had been sitting at your own family's Thanksgiving table while your son laughed and told everyone you were no longer important, would you have walked away? I didn't. I sat there while my own family mocked the grey hair I had earned, the old watch on my wrist, and the life they thought had already passed me by. My son looked me directly in the eyes and said, "Dad, you're not the man you used to be." Everyone laughed. I didn't, because 10 minutes later, the front door opened, and the governor of our state walked into that dining room.
It's time for a new chapter, Dad.
Are you truly ready for that?
Everything okay, Father?
It is nothing that concerns you. For now.
Looked past my son, past my daughter-in-law, past everyone who had been laughing at me, and said 2 words that changed the entire night. "Good evening, sir." My son stopped smiling. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was what the governor said next, and why he had come looking for me. "Stay with me, because by the time you learn what was inside the envelope he carried, you'll understand why I let my family believe I was powerless for far longer than they deserved." Welcome plus subscribe, and welcome to Vengeful Patriarch. If you enjoy stories about family betrayal, underestimated fathers, hidden truths, and the moment arrogant people discover they chose the wrong person to disrespect, you're in the right place. Subscribe now, because this series is built around one idea. Sometimes the quietest person at the table is the one person nobody should underestimate. Tonight, you're going to see exactly why. 3 days before Thanksgiving, my son Daniel called me. Not texted, not emailed, called. That alone caught my attention. Daniel was 42. He had the polished voice of a man who had spent years learning how to sound busy even when he wasn't saying anything important. "Dad," he said, "you coming Thursday? If you're still inviting me." There was a pause. "Of course I'm inviting you." That pause told me more than the words did. Daniel had never been good at hiding irritation. When he was a boy, he'd sigh before asking for money. As a teenager, he'd slam doors before asking for permission. As an adult, he'd become more sophisticated. Now he paused. "What time?" I asked. "4. "Dinner? Dinner?" Then, almost casually, he added, "And Dad, maybe keep it simple." I smiled even though he couldn't see me. "Simple how?" "You know, don't make a production out of anything." He didn't want me bringing stories. He didn't want questions. He didn't want me talking about the past. Most of all, he didn't want me reminding people who I had been before he decided I was inconvenient. But I said, "I'll be there." And that was the first decision I made that night that Daniel completely misunderstood. Pattern interrupt. Why would a father willingly walk into a room where he already knows he is not respected? Because sometimes walking into the room is the only way to learn who has been talking about you when you're not there. My name is Richard Hale. I was 71 that Thanksgiving. For most of my life, I had been the person people called when something went wrong. A factory problem, a contract problem, a payroll problem, a community problem. I spent 40 years building a manufacturing business from a rented warehouse with 2 employees into a regional company with hundreds of people depending on it. But Daniel didn't remember the warehouse. He remembered the office. He remembered the nice car. He remembered the vacations. Children are funny that way. They remember the comfort you created, not always the sacrifice required to create it. After my wife Margaret died, Daniel changed. Not overnight, that would have been easier. First, he stopped asking what I thought. Then he started telling me what I should think. Eventually, he stopped calling unless there was a reason. And then came the phrase I began hearing more often than my own name. "Dad needs to slow down." It sounded caring. But care has a very different sound when you listen closely. Sometimes "you need to slow down" really means "we need you to stop making decisions." I had noticed. I simply hadn't confronted him. Not yet. Thursday afternoon arrived cold and bright. I put on a charcoal suit, a white shirt, and the old watch Margaret had given me on our 25th anniversary. Before leaving, I looked at myself in the mirror. The face looking back at me had lines I didn't recognize when I was younger. But I didn't see weakness. I saw evidence. Evidence that I had survived things Daniel had never had to survive. When I arrived at his house, I could already hear laughter through the door. I knocked. My daughter-in-law Emily opened it. She looked me up and down. "Richard, you came. Not Dad. Not, 'We're glad you're here,' just, 'You came.'" I smiled. "Happy Thanksgiving, Emily." She stepped aside. "They're all in the dining room." I walked in. The conversation stopped. Daniel raised his glass. "Look who finally made it." I sat down. Daniel laughed. "Dad's still wearing that old watch." Emily looked at it. "Maybe it's the only thing he has left that still works." The table laughed. I looked at my watch, then at Emily. "It has worked for 30 years. Daniel leaned back. "That's the problem with old things, Dad. They keep running long after people should replace them." The room went quiet. That was the first time he crossed the line. But it wasn't the last. The turkey was carved. Wine was poured. Conversation resumed. And slowly Daniel began turning Thanksgiving into a trial. He talked about how successful he had become, how much responsibility he carried, how complicated the world had become. Then he looked at me. "Dad, you wouldn't understand." I smiled. "Try me." He laughed. "See, that's exactly what I mean." Emily joined in. "Richard, you should be enjoying retirement instead of pretending you still need to be involved in everything." I put down my fork. "Involved in what?" Emily looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at her. That exchange lasted less than a second. But I saw it. There was something they weren't telling me. Suddenly the dinner wasn't about insulting an old man. It was about testing whether that old man knew something. I decided not to ask. Instead, I said, "You're right. I'm getting old." Daniel smiled. He thought he had won. He hadn't. Pattern interrupt. Here's the strange thing about power. People often reveal their plans when they think you've already lost. Daniel had just started revealing his. Chapter 5, the question dessert came out. "Pumpkin pie?" "Coffee." Daniel leaned toward me. "Dad, there's something we should talk about." I knew this was coming. "Go ahead." "You've got to start thinking about the future." "I do." "No, I mean seriously." He glanced around the table. "Your generation thinks holding on to things proves you're strong." I waited. "Sometimes letting go is the mature thing." I asked one question. "Letting go of what?" Daniel smiled. "We'll talk later." That was when I knew. Whatever Daniel wanted, he didn't want to discuss it in front of everyone, which meant he was either embarrassed by it or afraid of what I might say. Then my granddaughter Lily walked into the room. She was 16. She looked at me and smiled. "Grandpa, are you okay?" I said. "I'm fine." She looked at her father, then back at me. Children notice more than adults think. So did I. And then my phone vibrated. Message. From a number I hadn't saved. "Do not leave before I arrive." I stared at the screen. I knew the sender. And suddenly I understood why Daniel had insisted I come to Thanksgiving. But I still didn't know why the sender was coming. I put the phone face down. Daniel noticed. "Everything okay?" "Fine." He studied me. "Who was that?" "Someone I know." "Who?" I smiled. "You'll find out." That was the first time Daniel looked nervous. Emily noticed too. She whispered something to him. They thought I couldn't hear. "Do you think he knows?" Emily asked. Daniel replied, "There's no way." I didn't turn around, but inside something hardened. They weren't discussing my retirement. They were discussing something they had done. And now I had confirmation. 3 months earlier, Daniel had called me asking for a favor. He said a community foundation needed an introduction. I made one phone call. That's all. I didn't tell him what that phone call meant. I didn't tell him who I had contacted. I didn't tell him what that person had once promised me. For 30 years, I had served quietly on a state economic development advisory council. I wasn't a politician. I didn't want to be. I worked behind the scenes. When companies needed help staying in the state, when workers needed retraining, when local businesses needed a bridge between government and private industry, I helped, and over the years I met people. People who remembered me. People who didn't care about my age. People who knew exactly what I had done. One of those people was now the governor. But Daniel didn't know that. He thought my involvement had ended years ago. He thought I had become invisible. That misunderstanding was about to become very expensive. At 7:43 p.m., someone knocked on the door. The conversation stopped. Emily looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at me. I took a sip of coffee. "Are you expecting someone?" he asked. I said, "Not anymore." Daniel stood and walked toward the door. He opened it. A security detail stood outside. Behind them was the governor. Daniel froze. Emily's face lost its color. My granddaughter Lily whispered, "Grandpa." The governor stepped inside. He looked around. Then he saw me. His expression changed. Across the room, he extended his hand. "Mr. Hale?" I stood. He shook my hand firmly. Then he said, "Sir?" Silence. Not ordinary silence, the kind of silence that happens when everyone realizes they have misunderstood the situation. Daniel stared at me. The governor looked at him, then back at me. "I hope I'm not interrupting." I said, "You're right on time." Daniel finally understood. The governor hadn't come for him. He had come for me. Chapter 9, the envelope. The governor carried a brown envelope. He placed it on the table. "I've been trying to deliver this personally." Daniel stared at it. "What's that?" The governor didn't answer him. He looked at me. "You told me 3 months ago that you didn't want recognition." I said, "I still don't." He smiled. "Unfortunately, the state has other ideas." Daniel stood behind his chair. "Dad?" I looked at him. "Yes?" "What's going on?" I said. "You tell me." The governor opened the envelope. Inside was a formal appointment. The governor had asked me to lead a statewide initiative designed to rebuild manufacturing communities. Daniel stared. "You?" I nodded. "Me." He laughed once because his brain couldn't fit the information into the picture he had created of his father. "But you're retired." I smiled. "Retirement is not the same thing as being finished." Then the governor said something that changed the temperature in the room. "There's one more matter." I looked at him. He looked at Daniel. "Mr. Hale asked me to make sure you received the information before Thanksgiving ended." Daniel swallowed. "What information?" The governor nodded toward the envelope. "Your father's recommendation." Daniel looked at me. "Recommendation for what?" I said nothing. The governor explained that months earlier, Daniel's company had applied for a major state partnership. Daniel had been proud of it. He had told people the approval was practically guaranteed. But the state had concerns about leadership continuity. The person asked for an informal assessment was me. After everyone left the table, Lily came into the kitchen. She hugged me. "Grandpa, I knew you weren't nobody." I laughed. "Who told you that?" She said, "Nobody, I just knew." Children sometimes understand what adults spend years refusing to see. She asked, "Are you really going to help Dad?" I said, "If he lets me." She smiled. "He will." I asked why. She said, "Because he finally knows you could have walked away." That sentence stayed with me because that was the truth. I could walk away. I could let Daniel fail. But revenge was never the goal. The goal was to make him see the difference between losing his father and losing access to what his father could give him. The next morning, Daniel came to my house. He didn't bring paperwork. He didn't bring a request. He brought coffee. He sat down. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. Finally, he said, "I was embarrassed by you." I looked at him. "Why? Because I thought everyone else had moved ahead and you were stuck in the past." I nodded. "And now?" He looked at me. "Now I think I was the one stuck." That was the moment I knew something had changed. Not because he had become successful, he already was. But because Daniel finally understood that age had not erased my value. It had simply made me quieter about it. A week later, Daniel's company received a second meeting with the state. He asked me whether I would attend. I said, "Do you want your father there?" He thought about it. Then he said, "I want the man who knows what he's doing there." That answer mattered. Not Dad. Not my father. The man who knows what he's doing. For the first time, he separated my role from our relationship. I agreed. But I made one condition. "When we walk into that meeting, you speak first." He looked surprised. "Why?" "Because it's your company." He smiled. "And if I mess up?" I smiled back. "Then you'll finally have a father who tells you the truth." Months later, Daniel told me Thanksgiving had been the worst night of his life. I asked why. He said, "Because I thought everyone saw you the way I did." I asked, "And they didn't?" He shook his head. "No, they saw what I refused to see. The governor still calls me occasionally, not because I'm powerful, because I kept my word. And Daniel? He's still learning. He still makes mistakes. He still gets impatient. But every once in a while, when we're sitting together, he'll ask, 'Dad, what do you think?' And I always answer, because that's what I wanted from the beginning, not obedience." Not control, respect. Final payoff. So why did the governor walk into my Thanksgiving dinner and call me sir? Not because I secretly owned the world. Not because I was richer than everyone at the table. And not because I wanted revenge. He called me sir because he knew the work I had done when nobody was watching. The factories saved, the workers helped, the communities rebuilt, the businesses given another chance. My family saw an old man. The governor saw a man who had spent 40 years proving that his word meant something. And that is the lesson Daniel finally learned. Never measure a person by how loudly they speak. Never confuse retirement with weakness. And never humiliate someone simply because you assume they no longer have anything to offer. Because sometimes the person sitting quietly at the end of the table has spent a lifetime building relationships you know nothing about. And sometimes the person you call old is the person the most important people in the room still call sir. If this story made you think about someone in your own family who was underestimated simply because they got older, tell me in the comments. Do you think Daniel deserved a second chance? Or should Richard have walked away and let him face the consequences alone? If you enjoyed this story, give the video a like. It helps this channel reach more people who appreciate stories about family, respect, betrayal, and second chances. If you're new here, subscribe to Vengeful Patriarch. The next story is about another family who made the mistake of believing an older man had nothing left to lose. Thank you for watching. And remember, age may slow your steps, but it doesn't erase the road. You've already walked. I'll see you in the next story. Daniel's father, the man he had just spent Thanksgiving calling old, irrelevant, and incapable. Daniel's face went blank. You knew? I nodded. I knew? And you didn't tell me? You didn't ask. That sentence landed harder than anything else I could have said. Daniel's anger returned. So this is revenge? I looked at him. No. Then what is it? Consequences. Daniel accused me of trying to control him. I almost laughed. The man who had spent years refusing to listen to his father was suddenly accusing that father of control. I said, Daniel, I never stopped you from becoming your own man. You judged me. I watched you. Same thing. No. I leaned forward. Judgment is deciding who you are. Watching is giving you time to show me. He had nothing to say. Then Emily spoke. Richard, you can't do this to your own son. I looked at her. I didn't. I pointed toward the envelope. He did. There was another truth I hadn't told Daniel. My work with the state had never really ended. For years I had quietly mentored young business owners. I had helped companies avoid bankruptcy, helped workers keep their jobs, and helped communities attract investment. But I never told Daniel because I wanted to know something. Would he respect me if I had nothing left to offer him? The answer came slowly. He respected what I could provide, not necessarily who I was. When my wife died, Daniel asked about my estate before he asked whether I was sleeping. When I retired, he asked what I was going to leave him. When I sold my old business stake, he asked where the money went. But he rarely asked how I felt. That was the real wound, not the joke.
Richard, 40 years. Your word has always meant something.
Not Thanksgiving. Not the governor. It was the realization that my son had spent years calculating my value, and I'd spent years hoping he would eventually see my worth without needing a number attached to it. The governor turned toward me. Sir, there's one decision we still need from you. Daniel looked up. The governor continued. The state partnership can move forward if you are willing to serve as senior advisor. Daniel's eyes widened. That meant I would have influence over the very program he wanted. Everyone waited. I looked at Daniel. He looked terrified. And for the first time that evening, I felt something other than anger. I felt pity, because I suddenly realized how badly he had misunderstood me. He thought power meant making people obey you. I had learned that real power was being able to help someone, and still choosing whether they deserved your help. I said, I'll accept. Daniel exhaled. Then I added, but not on the condition that my son receives anything. Daniel looked at me. Then what do I have to do? I said, become someone I can trust. The governor left at 8:21. The room remained silent. Daniel didn't sit down. He stood near the window. Finally he said, Why didn't you tell me? I answered, Because I wanted to know whether you'd love me when you thought I had nothing left. He looked at the floor. His shoulders dropped. Dad, I waited. I'm sorry. Those 2 words were the first honest words he had spoken all evening. But an apology is not a time machine. It doesn't erase years. It only opens a door. Whether someone walks through that door is up to them.